Hey everybody, JJ here, down in the dungeon, messing about with drums, as I normally do on days off. But I was taking a tangent today and then talking about, some of my favorite drummers and other such subjects I usually tackle for these videos. And I've been on a tangent of revisiting some albums I haven't listened to for a while and some drummers. And I was given a reminder, let's call it, from a gentleman who watches, I'm assuming a gentleman, has to be a gentleman with this name, Mean Metal Mike. Shout out to you because you reminded me of a video that I wanted to do and forgot to do because so many other things going on or whatever. But to talk about a drummer who is, he's influenced a lot of people, clearly, just through his band and his drumming. I mean, we talk about influential drummers like Neil Peart and Buddy Rich and all these guys, and a lot of the drummers are, they're more kind of recognized for their technical ability. Clearly, in the case of Neil Peart, there's songwriting, there's lyricism, there's all kinds of things associated with him. But as far as the drumming goes, it's always the guys, seemingly, it's always the guys who, have this huge technical ability that really, really get to recognize in kind of a broad sense. And in my opinion, that is amazing. It's amazing to have chops. It's amazing to have the ability to showcase it. But at the end of the day, we're playing music. I consider drummers musicians. It's probably all of us do. And, listening to drums on their own is a painful experience. I'm not a fan. I've played drums my whole life, and drum solos and things like that, it's just kind of doesn't do much for me. And technical drumming on its own doesn't do anything for me either. A musical context is very important for me. And even as I'm going about in any kind of drum composition that I do, musicality always comes first. You can insert something amazingly technical, but if it feels like fitting a square peg into a round hole, what's the point? And I've always held that. And getting to the point of this, drummers that don't have, let's call them, huge technical chops, and they showcase these things, they kind of get left behind in the the Mount Rushmore of top drummers of all time. And a certain generation looks at rock drummers and appreciates them, but I think in the days of today where chops and all this kind of stuff are more important, and very kind of outlandish drumming is in the days of social media, that gets a lot more views than a guy who just plays for the song. But ultimately, a drummer that plays for the song is if he plays what's necessary and he plays it and it feels good, it's like that music is gonna last for the rest of time. And 3 minutes into the video, I'm finally gonna mention the drummer's name. The drummer, I think, deserves that all the credit in the world for being one of the best rock drummers ever, is Phil Rudd from AC/DC. And I don't think, as far as drummers go, I don't think anyone would ever make the argument that Phil is unparalleled in his feel and his timing in that band. And there's many drummers who've kind of echoed the same thing that I think, where there's been different drummers in AC/DC. Simon Wright, who's an amazing drummer, just incredible. Played in Dio and just a litany of rock bands through the 80s. A drummer's drummer. And he was in AC/DC for a time. In the 90s, you had Chris Slade, the bald fellow with the bass drums behind him. That's how I remember him. And he incredible drummer as well. And AC/DC was on fire during that time when Chris was playing with them. But it wasn't Phil Rudd. And when Phil came back to the band in the mid-90s, I forget, I think it was for the Ball Breaker album, I want to say. And that was okay, it was obvious what was missing from AC/DC's music at that point, and it was Phil. And in my opinion, it's like, every member of, AC/DC is important, and I think they all have their place. And now that certain members are not there anymore, it's just like the band is, it's not AC/DC to me anymore. Like, it was one thing to replace Bon Scott for necessary reasons, and Brian Johnson's great as well, but Mao Young is AC/DC. He wrote the songs. He's the leader of the band, and him not being there anymore was a huge loss for the band. Like, just the band isn't the band anymore without him. And Phil is out of the band again as well. And so, I mean, getting to his drumming, I mean, this AC/DC needs no introduction, and everybody knows the songs and stuff. But AC/DC gets accused, of kind of like writing the same song over and over again. And, my argument to that is always like, everyone's entitled to their opinion, but my argument has always been, well, if the song is awesome and everybody loves it, it's just like, okay, like they have their style and they have their niche that they're in. And, if that's what pleases them at the end of the day, and, they're happy to do those songs, and, who are we to say that they should go and write it's like, would you want AC/DC to write like a 8-minute progressive rock song like Dream Theater? Like, I don't know if they have the capacity to do it, firstly, but it's just like, what would it be? You can imagine these bands, and I imagine the opposite scenario. Would you want Dream Theater to write an AC/DC song? Would it be good? Like, these bands have their niches and these things they fall into and things that they like. And I think ultimately that's what it comes down to, is that, musicians are, I mean, it's a selfish endeavor. You're writing ultimately to please yourself. And if you're not, then like, you're just, I don't even understand the reason why you would want to write to please other people. And, you'd always be glad that they're happy to come along with you. But at the end of the day, it's like, it's your art, and you've got to kind of be satisfied by it and things like that. And if AC/DC is satisfied to keep, doing Thunderstruck and, Girls Got Rhythm and all these songs, and, those songs are, they're, what's the correct way to kind of think about it? I mean, they're just classics. Like, those songs will stand the test of time. Like, they're always gonna be, you could do a modern interpretation. If you think the production sounds outdated for some reason or something like that, you could take those songs and plant them into kind of like any genre. You could do a country version of, Highway to Hell. And you could do any genre almost. You could take those songs and you could plant them into different genres and some different elements and still have great songs. And, ultimately, I think that's what it comes down to, is that they just wrote so many great songs. And a huge part of the reason people so widely adopted AC/DC and they're so widely appreciated, I think, is the simplicity of the drumming, of the, the rhythms. They're easily approachable. And I can say that as well, like, as a young musician, coming into learning about music and things like that. Like, drums are particularly a difficult instrument, I think, to approach. Every instrument has its hurdles when you're beginning. And, starting out with drums, guitar is like, okay, it's your hands. Obviously, it's very complex. Drumming engages basically your entire body. And to get the mechanics of early drumming down, one of the bands that I just played along to endlessly, like just learning drums, was AC/DC. And it was not a huge barrier to entry. Like, you could, the songs, you could learn many AC/DC songs just by learning the same beat. And it, in the same way, it like teaches you about drum arrangement. Like, how do you take the same beat put it into different songs, add little variances, make signature little things like accents, tasteful use of cymbals. Like, there is so much musicality in that drumming that when you dig through it and analyze it at a deeper level than the surface, you'll see like where you can take these things, these simple ideas, and you can add little subtleties, little variances, little accents, and you can make whole new things out of it. You don't have to do these broad sweeping like changes, and inserting on time signatures, and you can do those things if you want, but it's not necessary. And especially for the type of music. Like, if you all of a sudden took an AC/DC song and people are dancing and, like having a great time, nodding their heads to it, and then throw a section in there that's 7/8 just to have a more complex drum arrangement, like you're missing the point, from a musical standpoint. And, some people make it work, and, there's plenty of instances where there's, a band like Soundgarden that does have odd time signatures. Soundgarden has a ton of songs that are in odd time signatures, but Matt Cameron always found a way to find where the pulse was and where it felt good, and he made it work. But it never needed to be there in AC/DC songs. And Phil's hi-hat playing, in particular, I'd love to focus on that because Phil has probably the best dynamics on hi-hat of almost any drummer. There's obviously people that kind of are as good as him and have the same swing and the same feel. And a lot of that comes from Phil's hi-hat playing. And that was something that I took note of very early on from listening and also reading some interviews with other drummers. And my kind of real affinity for Phil developed through Lars Ulrich. And at the time when Metallica put out the Black Album, Lars talked for a long time about how he was on this constant pursuit of, technicality and trying to keep up with all these other drummers and, this competition that was amongst, the thrash drummers and the heavy metal guys. And it was a, hitting, at some point you're hitting a brick wall with that, whether it's from a musical standpoint or your ability or these other things. And, when Metallica gets into writing the Black Album, I see interviews with him talking extensively about how he had gone away from listening and competing and basically kind of isolated himself and listened to the things that he loved growing up. And AC/DC was one of those bands and a huge influence on Lars. And, growing up, he was an influence. And then during the writing of the Black Album, Phil Rudd comes back around for Lars and becomes basically his main influence to approach drums in that style. And, obviously the Black Album was very derisive amongst fans and things like that. But, it's just, man, the drumming is so good on that album. Like, it's perfect. It's perfectly suited for those songs and, that style. Lars has his signature stuff in there still and his Larsisms. And, but just the simplifying of what he was doing. He always had simplistic nature in his drumming. Like, there's nothing too complex about like For Whom the Bell Tolls or something like that. But for him to embrace it as wholly as he did during that time and use Phil as his main influence, and it was very cool for me, and it just reaffirmed that Phil is very heralded amongst other drummers, and he is a one of the drummers you should look at if you are trying to develop feel and timing and things like that. And of particular note, back to the hi-hat, was Lars talked about the swing that Phil had in his hi-hat. And, to me, the hi-hat is the most dynamic instrument on the whole drum set. And, obviously, we have a limitless amount of dynamics with every and any drum. But I've always been more attracted to the hi-hat in the sense that you can do open and close accents. There's an infinite amount of variation in sound between a slightly open, slightly closed. These millimeters of open and closed variation make differences in the sound. And you've got, from the bell all the way down to the edge. And there's just, it's to me the most complex instrument on the whole drum set. And I can find endless amounts of variation to introduce into hi-hats with accents and foot splashes. It combines, it is the only instrument on the whole drum set that actually ties in feet and hands at the same time for one instrument. The variations you can introduce with foot pressure and all this kind of stuff. It just introduces so many variables for dynamics and accents and things. And reading about Lars talking about Phil's swing and the pulse that Phil was able to introduce into these songs, where accents and swung 8th and 16th notes, and just it even though the bass drum and the snare drum are let's call them on a grid, boom ch, boom ch, in between is where the magic for Phil Rudd is. And the in-between is mostly him in his hi-hat. And I've seen a lot of videos watching Phil, a lot of concert videos, a lot of live footage, in all of his different eras. And that's just, it's been the same. It's always been the same dynamic with him and his hi-hat playing. And it's so interesting to watch. And all of his feel and his swing and timing is all coming from that right hand, and these kind of he doesn't too often play just quarter notes and these more aggressive, kind of staccato notes. It's always has a swinging feel to it, and I've very much adopted that. I know for a fact that there's a lot of songs, when I interpret them, when I do my cover of them, it would normally just be an 8th note or a quarter note hi-hat, and I always introduce the extra note. It helps my timing. I think it helps fill out bar lines, unless it's something very specific and it needs to be this. I would 9 times out of 10, I'm adding, not all the time, but maybe an extra little accent, a triplet, something like that in there, just to get that swing and try to emulate, Lars's swing in certain eras, but ultimately it's Phil's swing that he has. And if you're playing AC/DC, it has to have swing. It's the only way that you can play the songs correctly and have them feel good. You Shook Me All Night Long, if you just played it all the same volume notes, it's going to be stiff. It's going to be, it ain't going to feel good, put it that way. And it has to be swung. And listening, I'm talking 1990, 1991. I'm 9 or 10 years old, and I'm kind of getting this realization that, these drummers that I like they have this swing to their playing, and it feels like a pulse. It doesn't feel like, electronic drums really have that staccato, it's all the same volume, early electronic drums, and that has its own kind of a feel and its own place in music as well. But if you're trying to introduce that into a song that doesn't have it, it's going to feel forced and it's going to feel awkward. And I can't tell you how many times I just sat and put on Back in Black and just played along and tried to get that swing. And I didn't really even have a drum set at that point, so I was trying to even just get the swing and develop that on pillows, on my bed, on a floor, anything where I could just kind of feel that pattern, a louder note followed up by a quieter note to get the pulse, and just endlessly practiced along with that. And while I was still learning drums, that was a great time to introduce that idea, because that kind of swing and that playing has basically become the de facto standard for how I kind of approach playing the hi-hat. And the ride cymbal as well. I always, all the cymbals, I always have You know, you can see it in my hand. It's just that the extra little thing on the end, and it just, sometimes I don't do it, sometimes and it adds an accent, sometimes I do it, and sometimes it adds a different accent. It's interesting drumming, even though it's, it's very narrow focus, the minutia of drumming, and the very the detail oriented stuff that I like to get into. But yeah, I know I'll even introduce that on the ride cymbal with accents, and there's a lot of drummers that did that as well. But Phil never really played ride cymbal, and there's not too often he really even played like a washy crash cymbal. I'm almost hard pressed to think of an AC/DC song that's not pretty much all just played on the hi-hat. And I don't know if that's because Phil is a devotee of the hi-hat like I am, if it's his preferred rhythmic element, if it's just he's not really self-professed from him, he's not really that highly trained of a drummer. He has a very specialized thing that he does extremely well. And so maybe he just, doesn't really play a lot of ride cymbal, or doesn't feel it's necessary. But I don't think it's necessary for him either. I think the hi-hat works great for him, clearly. And but yeah, being young, listening to Phil, learning that style, learning the swing, being able to approach AC/DC songs because there was so many of the same drum beats, I could learn a lot of AC/DC songs without necessarily having to learn new drum beats, new things, and it prevented me from getting bored listening to one song over and over again, or practicing one thing over and over again. A thing with practicing in music for me has always been, I've never been a big fan of just sitting here and practicing paradiddles. I've always loved incorporating a paradiddle into music and finding the musical context for these things. You can sit here all day and practice, quads between your hands and your feet and stuff, but it's finding places to insert them into music, and having them fit in bar lines and time signatures and stuff. And it's I'm perhaps lucky in a way where the mechanics of drumming kind of always came pretty easily to me. And so I've been able to implement ideas and things into music perhaps a bit quicker, unless it's a very complex passage or something like that. But, being young and being able to approach so many AC/DC songs, develop that swing, and, just work on timing, work on all that stuff. That was the best, for a young drummer, that was some of the best musical training I think I had. And you don't get that from a book. You can't get that from a book. It's listening. It's being exposed to music and all that kind of stuff. And I've always been a proponent where it's your ear is your best tool. Your ear and listening, and it's the best tool in your toolkit as a drummer. And if you can hear something and translate it and find musical context for it, then you can adapt to many styles and many ideas quite easily. So look at that, almost 24 minutes into a video about Phil Rudd. I think that reiterates the impact that his drumming had, and his influence on me. I can't it might not be obvious in some of my playing and things like that. I tend to, I have a pretty wide musical horizon, and but AC/DC has been there since the very beginnings of my drumming, and luckily I was able to have the right influences to kind of steer me more towards guys like Phil, and being able to develop certain things. And I'm not nearly as good at Phil as Phil, obviously. Phil has his own thing, and I'm just merely emulating it. But or trying my best to emulate it anyways. But I do try my best, because it's a very high watermark to Phil. And everybody can play AC/DC songs, but the real test is, can you make them feel like an AC/DC song? And if you're able to do that, then you're on the right track. and you've got the right idea, and you've also taken the right influence from Phil. It's about feel. It's about, making people dance. It's about, it's just about those things. It's not about showing off. It's not about, who has the greatest chops. It's not about inserting square pegs into round holes and finding ways to make them work. It's just about simplicity. It's about the feel. And at the end of the day, I think if you would talk to Phil Rudd about that kind of thing, I think he would probably express the same sentiment. Is that he's not interested probably in a lot of these pursuits, and he's found something that works for him and something that he likes to do, and he's perfected it. And that's a thing to greatly admire amongst somebody. He's unparalleled in his approach to rock drumming, and doesn't nearly get the credit of the more kind of the Mount Rushmore guys like a Neil Peart or somebody like that. But in the grand scheme of music, AC/DC's impact is obviously massive, and a massive part of that impact is Phil Rudd. And I don't think anybody would probably deny that, even the band themselves. And whatever their relationship has been with Phil over the years, Phil has been in and out, of the band multiple times. Obviously, there's some conflict there, let's call it. But I think the guys in AC/DC were, they were present enough to realize that Phil's contribution is, guys that play simply like him, the idea is that they can be easily replaced. And it's actually, it's not the opposite of that, where somebody, Phil is not easily replaced, because what he's doing is so much more complex than what people kind of give it credit for. And, it's just, I think the guys in AC/DC recognize that all the times that he's been back in the band, and, it's, they realize they've got something special when they all play together, sort of thing. And it's just AC/DC is one of those bands that never lost that as they got older. As the original lineup would come back together, it would be right back to what it was. And that magic was always there. And you need the members, the original guys, to kind of achieve that. So, but this is, thank you again for the recommendation to Mean Metal Mike, to remind me to do this long video about Phil Rudd. But it's been on my mind to do it for quite a while. And Phil is one of my drumming heroes. And hopefully, if you're starting on drums or looking for some influence, and you can look to Phil and his drumming in AC/DC as the barrier to entry is low with him. You can play the same beat and kind of play a lot of AC/DC songs. But the magic and the hard part is practicing those songs to make them feel like how Phil does them. And if you get that, you're on the right track. And drumming will come easy to you. And the mechanics will be. It's easy to integrate a lot of things once you get the basics down. And there's no better band to approach the basics with than AC/DC, in my opinion, and Phil Rudd. So check him out if you haven't. This has been the very long video about Phil Rudd. But check him out if you haven't, and thanks for watching. Cheers.